Hello, everybody. I'm Jérémie Mercier. It's the first time I'm animating this broadcast in English, so please be nice with me. But I'm going to invite in a few seconds Denis Rancourt and Marine Baudin. We're going to talk about our latest article on the analysis of mortality in the US since 2020. And I'm the person in charge of this broadcast, Science en Conscience, so in English, Science with Consciousness, for the collective RéinfoCovid. RéinfoCovid mainly works in French, but for this first time, we're going to work in English, and I hope we're gonna reach people in the English-speaking community. So first the theme, and then we'll invite Marine and Denis. See you in 45 seconds. So today is a very special day because we're doing this broadcast in English first, and we'll see you in a few hours in French. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Marine Baudin. Hi, Marine.
Hi, Jérémie.
And Denis Rancourt. Hi, Denis.
Hello.
So actually, it's the first time. We were just chatting about that a few minutes ago. It's the first time we talk in English together. So Denis is discovering our very English,
lovely
lovely accent. Yes,
lovely accent.
That's right. We've written, I think, 4 or maybe more papers together.
4 papers.
Together as co-authors. Very big reports. And in the whole time, when we discuss things regularly and often, it's always in French.
Exactly.
I've never heard you speak English before. Either of you. I know you do.
Yeah.
But I had not heard you.
I had heard Denis, of course. So
Yes.
I had heard Denis, of course, in English because most of your interviews are in English. I think I was one of the first persons to interview you during this COVID era in French about masks. That was in May 2020, so quite like 2 years ago now. And we started working together on France, mortality in France, then Canada, then the US, and again, we were working on the US. And it was very obvious that we should do something in English, a video in English. I mean, all the papers are in English because it's the language of science, but we have to make this video in English as well. So it's quite new for my followers here in the French-speaking community, in RéinfoCovid or on my pages, but it's going to be fun. And yeah, maybe I'm going to reach other people in the English-speaking world, and it's going to be fun as well. So yeah,
I can't wait to hear Marine's accent now.
So
okay, so please, Marine, introduce yourself just to tell us who you are.
all right. So hi, Jérémie. Hi, Denis. Hi, everybody. I'm Marine Baudin. I did a PhD in microbiology in Paris. So it was ENS Cachan and École Normale Supérieure de Paris, which became École Centrale Paris afterwards. And since then, I am working as an independent researcher.
Okay.
And I met Jérémie, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
3 years ago now, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the year after, we started to collaborate with Denis as well. So for the first paper on France 2 years ago.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. And Denis, please introduce yourself.
Well, okay, I was a professor at the University of Ottawa. My formal training was in physics, but I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. I've worked in many areas of science. I've written over 100 articles in top-level peer-reviewed journals on many topics, everything from environmental science through materials science through things related to cosmology, etc. So I'm a very interdisciplinary guy, always have been, and my science funding during my career was also very interdisciplinary. And I got very concerned and very upset with what was happening in the propaganda sphere regarding COVID. And I noticed that the scientific establishment was participating in the propaganda, was an integral part of that propaganda. So I became very concerned right away, and I decided I would use my talents to write scientific reports that are based on the scientific literature and that are critical of some of the crazy views that were being advanced by my colleagues and by medical doctors, and of course by the media.
But knowing your background, Denis, I can't imagine you were surprised that scientists were part of the propaganda.
Yeah, it's the degree to which it became obvious during COVID was stunning, even to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can still be surprised by obedience of the so-called scientific community.
Yes,
Okay.
I think there's a word that we're always afraid to say, but I think we need to say it. It needs to be heard more and more, and it's the word fascism. And under a fascist system, the corporate and elite entities control everything, including the doctrines that are followed by the professionals that truly become service professionals. And those professionals, that includes the media, the scientists, everybody. And so as society evolves more and more towards that kind of a society, then that obedience becomes more and more complete, if you like. Yeah.
And we've seen that this obedience is massive. It's wow. Yeah, I was very shocked. I'm still very shocked, but yeah, we're working. At least we could find some other scientists that are actually following our work, giving great feedback as well. So we're not alone, but we're a small minority. So yeah. Okay.
And I'm hoping that our work, and I think it's already the case, that the quality and depth of our work will impact thoughtful scientists, no matter where they're working. It will impact them. It will send a clear message, and they are hearing it. Many cannot hear it. Many do not want to hear it. Many feel threatened even to hear it. But there are others who cannot avoid but to hear what we have to say.
Yeah. Okay. So the video we're doing today is related to the latest article we published. It's on ResearchGate on this web link that's in the comments. It's also in the description of the video. And let's start with how we ended up working on that subject on mortality in the US. Why specifically the US? Why? So we started with France because Marine and I were, well, French. Even if we're not in France, I mean, Marine is in Prague, in Czech Republic, and I'm in Tallinn, in Estonia.
No, but we started with France also because we have to admit the French government has amazing data.
Database
Is very good. Yeah.
Data.
Yeah. We could go back until pre-war, Second World War, I think.
Yeah.
And
right after maybe. Yeah.
And extremely detailed, with many more components that are made public and accessible. Then it's extraordinary in that sense. So that attracted us to France. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, the data was a very good, important factor in our decision to start with France. Then we did Canada because you're there, you've experienced it. The provinces have had different policies during that period, and we could compare the different provinces of Canada. So it was very interesting as well.
Yes.
And then we had to look at your neighbor because you're like 200 kilometers from the US border, right? Something like that.
Yeah, and a little more than that, but yeah.
250, 300.
Okay.
Okay, whatever. It's very close, very close.
Closer than us.
And surprisingly, the situation is totally different in the US. What has happened since 2020 is like another story. It's another world.
Exactly.
And we've described that in the third article, but we had to go deeper, and we also had to update our data because we had seen 1 year and a half, but now we're more than 2 years after, so we can have a good and solid view on the first 2 years of this COVID era. And we're going to talk to present you today our analysis and the description of what we observed. So yeah, so what is maybe, Marine, the most striking thing you've seen with mortality data in the US since 2020?
Yes. So as you said, Jeremy, the US is a totally different world, but it's also a big world because it's a state. The states are to the scale of a continent, so we have
Yeah.
a very good, different. We can have an heterogeneity in the data, and we can also have like the CDC. Most of the data we have from the CDC or Census Bureau, so they are also very good at providing data by state, by age group, by sex, but whatever you want to look at, usually it's accessible. So it was a very good database to dig in. And also, if you say something, if something about the United States, you can be sure like it's not like an exception you observe. It's like a really good data.
There are so many people, 300 million people in the US, so
30, yeah.
you have some significance in statistics
Exactly.
for sure. Mm-hmm.
But also, I would insist on the fact that the individual states are truly individual jurisdictions,
Yes.
have very different rules and responses. So it's like studying 50 different countries,
Yep.
Some of which are side by side. And the side by side is important in a pandemic because supposedly it spreads. And so geographical proximity, even the huge contact between Canada and the US is very relevant in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Why were there 1.27 million deaths, excess deaths in the US during the COVID period, and virtually none even on a per capita basis in Canada? How can you think of this as being a pandemic of a viral respiratory disease? So that's the other thing too.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's
okay.
Yeah. So as Denis just mentioned, that one of the biggest, because in the previous article on USA, we didn't really quantify the excess mortality. We did observe the anomalies in the mortality that we will describe maybe later, but we didn't quantify it. So now this new paper is actually showing the methodology to quantify that excess mortality during the COVID period in the United States is 1.27 million deaths.
Yeah, so that's a huge number.
Yes, and I want to insist on that. We really developed a quantification method that's very robust, that's very reliable on, how do you do this? It's a big problem. And we found a very good way of doing it, a very clever way, I think. And we're able to quantify also by age group and by state. And we did all that, and we reported all the quantifications. So if any researcher wants to try to correlate those numbers to anything that they might know about the individual states and so on, they can do it. And we did a lot of that ourselves as well. Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe we should start by showing a graph of all-cause mortality in the US since the year 2000, just to show what happened, so that visually people see that there is a pre-2020 trend and there is a new world after 2020. And also, maybe let's start with just saying why we look at all-cause mortality and not COVID mortality or viral respiratory disease mortality.
Yeah, so if I jump in, the all-cause mortality is the most reliable data you can get and look at if you want to have fundamental answers, because you cannot trick it. It's like a death is 0 or 1.
Yeah,
But
you're
if you
dead or
start,
your life.
exactly.
Simple as that.
But if you start looking at death from a specific cause, whatever the specific cause is, then you already put a lot of biases inside, like how do you test it, how do you report it, and there is like maybe a political influences and so on.
Even the biological question of determining a cause of death is very tricky, very ambiguous, because death is the breakdown. It's a nonlinear breakdown of many systems all together. That it's very hard to say this was the cause. Usually you start with a certain disease, then you have comorbidities that come in, then something else might happen, and the organs and the systems may fail at different times. So there's some combination of things happening. Even just the notion of a cause of death, except in the obvious case of a brutal accident or something like that. But even the notion in terms of disease is very, very difficult to grapple with. and therefore it's subject to political interference and influence. And this is well known. MDs are well known to be affected by what is generally believed in the population to be a new disease or a new pandemic, what's popular to claim as a cause of death. This has a huge effect on what will end up on the birth certificate, for example. The death certificate.
and people may also die not only from the disease but from the treatment. And so yeah, it's another story, but but there are so many biases in the way you count a death, in the way you attribute a cause to the death. So we've chosen to look at all-cause mortality, which is the least biased way to look at deaths.
And
So,
that's the point. And the second point I would add as well, it's like it's also indicator of what's going on in the population. If you look at the all-cause mortality, any signal, like one way or another, if it's increasing or if it's decreasing, will tell you something is happening at least. So that's
on the scale of the society, what's really happening that causes death. It's not ambiguous like just counting, filtering out and counting particular deaths in particular circumstances. You really see on the scale of the society what's happening.
Okay. So tell me, okay, I can share your screen then, Marine. Yep. Okay. Yes. So here we are.
So here we go.
Yep.
So I always like to say what we are looking at in the graph. So here we just discussed it's all-cause mortality, but by month. So we count all the death that's happening in a month in the USA from, I think it's from January 1999 till December 2021. So that's the whole period here.
Yeah.
And as you see, so there is we described it, I mean, it's known, but we described it before. There is these cycles. Every year there is an increase in all-cause mortality during the winter season and a decrease towards the summer, and so on, one year after another. So that's pretty regular. You see, like from 1999 to 2020, there is, maybe you can see a little bit increase, like on the baseline. But here, this is it. This vertical line here shows the month of February 2020, right before the World Health Organization announced the pandemic. So they announced it on March 11, 2020. And this data are by month. And you see, as soon as they announced it, in March, we see like this huge increase in mortality, and we are reaching a totally new regime like we've never seen before in the United States, at least for the last 20 years, and even before. Yeah, and that's crazy. So this is what we were thinking. What could it be? And let's dig into this. What is so special?
And the seasonal variations before the COVID period, you can go back to the Second World War, and before the Second World War, the beginning of the century, and so on. It's a very well-known phenomenon, very regular, and it occurs everywhere in the mid-latitude countries, in the northern and southern hemisphere. It's a very fundamental phenomenon that is not completely understood. There's still a lot of debate as to why there is this pattern, but the point is there is a regular pattern. There is a clear historic trend, and then, as you said, Marine, there's this break to a new regime where we don't even come down close to the summer baselines that we were seeing before. So yeah, quite a break.
So for the first time in 2020, there is no summer baseline in mortality in the US.
Yes, exactly. We would expect it to go back to the baseline that we discussed. You have to imagine that there is a line going like on the lower parts of the mortality, all-cause mortality, and it doesn't go back. Actually, it picks up even more.
In the summer, where there would normally be a trough, we find peaks. And I think there's a graph that shows a blow up in time of that region. Yes, that's the by-month data.
By month, we have the by. Sorry, I need to find the proper one. The by week data. So you will see this is the one.
Oh yeah.
So here the same ideas, but now it's by week. So all-cause mortality, all the deaths which are happening by week in the USA from the first week of 2015 to the week 5 of 2022. And again,
yeah, you don't get the same drop like, for example, in the by-month data, we had a drop in February because it only has 28 days typically. Yep. And so there was artifacts related to how you integrate the deaths. But in this case, a week always has 7 days. Yep. So there's no artifact of counting, and there's a higher time resolution, and you can really see what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And same, we notice again this seasonal pattern from 2015 to 2020. And this vertical line here shows the week 11 of 2020, which is exactly the week of the 11th of March 2020 when the WHO declared the pandemic.
Yeah. And you see very well this first never seen before summer peak 1. And you see another winter peak that we call COVID peak 2. It's huge. And then it goes down, but not down enough to go back to the summer baseline you would have expected. And then again, in the summer, this big increase. The summer peak 2 is actually even bigger than the summer peak 1, and it's much higher than winter peaks before the COVID period.
Just the idea that there would be peaks in mid or late summer is unheard of. In terms of epidemiology, it's never been seen before. The only time you would have peaks in all-cause mortality in the summer is in relation to a heat wave, but that's usually very, very specific in time. It lasts only days or a week or something like that. And so it gives very sharp peaks. Yep. These are not sharp peaks. They're very broad, and they relate to the whole society. They're not localized on the hot spot of the heat wave. So this is a very unusual phenomenon that you would have all-cause mortality peaks in the summer like that.
For instance, Denis, you were just describing. So this is kind of the peak which would happen in the summer, very sharp, with related to the heat wave.
Yeah, that's a heat wave that occurred on the West Coast in the states of Washington and Oregon, I believe. Yeah. And it lasted only days and gave rise to that huge spike there. But only in those states, only at that time, and very, very sharp in time. That's an example of a heat wave. And throughout a lot of data like this in many countries, you can spot these heat waves. But otherwise, it's never been seen before to have systematically an actual peak in the summer period in any countries that show this pattern. So you have to ask, what the heck is going on? And it brings us to the next important feature of our data, is that this was not happening in every state. It was very heterogeneous by state.
Yeah. What a strange virus. It doesn't act the same way depending on states, and it doesn't attack in the same way. We'll see that later, depending on the age as well. We've never seen a virus like that, right?
Yeah, one would argue from classic immunology that it's impossible that this could be due to a known viral respiratory disease. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the viruses, as you say, Jérémie, I think you're hinting at this, they do not decide to cross or not cross state boundaries or boundaries between countries. The borders, national borders, and so on, that the viruses don't see that.
Well, if we are in the narrative of the virus, at least, and the border between Canada and the US is one of the longest in the world, 8,500 kilometers, something like that.
Yes, but it's not a closed border. Those are two of the greatest economic exchange partners in the world. There's trucks and transports and cars crossing that border continuously everywhere. Yeah.
Okay, so we observed this very strange new regime of mortality in the US, and then how did we start to analyze and understand what was happening in the US?
So as we said before, so we observed this graph you've just seen. There is a huge increase in all-cause mortality by time as a function on time since 2020 in the States. So the first thing we wanted to do is to quantify this. So there is a way we developed of doing it, which is we will integrate the mortality in the whole COVID period, which means the COVID period is, it depends if we're talking by month or by week because of data, but it's from, for instance, by month, it's from March 2020 till December 2021. And we sum up all the death during that period. That's one variable we have. Then, so this, and by the way, this we did this by week as well. So by month data, it's 22 months. So the COVID period by month is 22 months, and the COVID period by week is 100 weeks. And so if we do 22 months, we do the sum up of all-cause mortality for this whole period. And that's one thing. And the second thing, we have the same integration, the same length period of the same length of periods, but the period just before the COVID. So
we look at after and before with the same timelines.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's important to say that this is a very straightforward thing to do mathematically, and it's so much more robust than what is traditionally done. Traditionally, researchers will fit a kind of sinusoidal function through that regular pattern, and then they'll continue it. They'll presume an extrapolation into the period of interest, and then they'll try to say what the uncertainty bounds are on that sinusoidal, and then they'll say that anything outside that bounds is an anomaly, and they integrate deaths outside that bounds. There is so much that can go wrong with that procedure, and it is so arbitrary that we decided not even to try to go there, and that instead our procedure would be much more clear, because by this integration that is now shown, you can integrate period by period. You can see the historic trend of integration over that time period that is of interest to you. And so you can clearly see the trend in the raw data itself, and then you can clearly see that sudden rise that corresponds to the integration for the COVID period. So you can see that it's clearly abnormal, above anything that you would think of as the trend. And you can say, well, the difference between the last point or the point that you would presume if you were to extrapolate, that's going to be a very good approximation of what we could call the excess mortality, because the error on those dark points, which is the integral, is very, very small, much smaller than the size of the point, given the statistics that are involved. So taking the difference there is a very accurate and very good way. You immediately see in this graph what the trend is, what it has to be, what it cannot be, and you immediately see the difference that you're going to be taking, and you immediately have a sense of how robust and significant that excess is. So I think that's a really good way to, and it because it's such a long period, you already taking into account what would be the seasonal variations within that period. You've got almost 2 years there,
yes.
so it takes into account the seasonal variations. So that's how we've decided to integrate and quantify.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we did that for the whole United States. We just say before it's 1.27 million extra deaths. And we did it by state and by age groups. For
using the same procedure.
Exactly, same procedure, and twice, because we had the monthly data and we had the weekly data.
Yep.
So I don't know if you want to see some age group.
Yeah,
sure.
let's see some age groups.
So
yeah,
let's go to the age groups. So here, all-cause mortality by month, USA, so that's the light blue line. For the younger one, under 15 years old, from 2000 to 2021. And as we described before, the integrated payoff of the 22 months over the same time.
So 14 years and younger.
Yep.
Yes.
So we see the historic trend, and we do not see for that age group on the scale of the entire country, we do not see an increase in the COVID period. In fact, it's hard to say that it wasn't just the regular trend that you would have expected.
Yes, exactly.
They seem like they are doing quite well during this pandemic.
It appears from this data, yeah. But then
we move on to next group.
Yep.
So that's the
quite different.
15-24 included.
Mm-hmm.
15 years old to 24 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And now clearly there's a step in the COVID period.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we're starting to see it even in among these young people, that there was a very significant excess mortality associated with the COVID period.
Yes.
Mhm.
And as we go with the age increases, we keep on seeing this huge step for the
This is
25 to 34 years old now.
Yeah.
Right.
So there was a trend of an increase somehow, but then this increase is really sharp. We've never seen that before.
You can see in the data itself, there's like a wall, a stepwise increase, and you never come down from that high mortality after that stepwise increase, after the pandemic was announced. So somehow the virus knew to listen to the World Health Organization declaration of a pandemic, to start killing people right at that time, and to not stop from that point on. For this age group, the virus knew to do that.
Yeah.
It appears in the United States, and it did that in every country simultaneously. As soon as the World Health Organization made its pronouncement, everywhere where there's excess mortality, there was a step like that in this age group, and then it didn't come down again. And we see it in for example, we see it in Alberta, a province of Canada. We see it in France. We see it in many places. It's quite a remarkable virus when you think about it. It's
a clever virus, I would say.
Yes. And also sometimes it hit it right in some states. For instance, the virus hit right at the declaration of the pandemic, and in some states nothing happened until the next summer. So it's
right. It was very heterogeneous. Where it happened synchronously at the same time.
Exactly.
But in many places it did not happen. So there's this great heterogeneity. And yeah, yeah.
do you have graphs? Can you show a graph maybe of different states? So maybe we finish first with the different age
to
groups.
see the other age groups if some people are interested.
So you see this again, this very huge increase, this spike in mortality for the age group 35 to 44 years old.
Yes, same for. It's even worse because it was on a decreased trend, and then
bam,
45, 54.
45 to 54 now that we're looking at. Quite again, just a whole other regime. Is just so remarkable.
Yes.
And one of the things that now this is, what year is that? 55 to 64 year old.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 more groups. Or 3 maybe.
64. Okay.
64
and then above 75.
And above 85 plus. 85 as well.
Yes.
That's the last.
Right.
So yeah.
Right.
So we see an increase for all age groups apart from the younger ones, the under 14 years old, right?
Exactly.
Yes. And this increase is not the same depending on age groups. It's quite remarkable in, is it like 20, 44 years old, something like that? And surprisingly, because we hear on the TV that this very clever virus usually attacks the older people. And that's not what we see when we observe the all-cause mortality.
Yeah. So there are arguments to be made and a whole analysis to be done regarding the age dependence of the mortality, which allows us to conclude and to be critical of the idea that this was even COVID-19 itself, because there have been many studies about what is the age dependence of the infection fatality ratio, which is known and measured to be, under controlled clinical conditions, is known to be exponential with age. And so we can make those comparisons, and we do that in the paper. But one of the most important things about the paper, I think, and in doing this study, is that we came to understand the incredibly heterogeneous nature of this mortality, meaning that not only heterogeneous by jurisdiction, but also we came to visualize that it was really certain societal groups that were dying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. because we demonstrated a very strong correlation with poverty, for example, with obesity, with whether or not you're on social assistance programs. And we were the first to really conclusively demonstrate these incredibly strong correlations. I would like us to go to a graph of the correlation graph for poverty, for example, because it's so important and impressive. Yes. Okay. Here it is. So you have excess mortality by state normalized by population of the state on the y-axis versus the fraction of the population in the state that is living in poverty, expressed as a percentage. And you have this very strong correlation. The Pearson correlation coefficient is 0.86 plus 0.86, which is called very strong. That's how it should be qualified scientifically. And this kind of strong correlation is very rare to see clearly in epidemiology or in any of the social sciences or medical sciences. This is a remarkably strong correlation. And it's not just a correlation, it's a proportionality, because the line, the best line fit goes through the origin, which implies that a state that has 0 people living in poverty would have had no excess mortality. So it's a proportionality. If you double one, you double the other, and so on. This is an absolutely stunning result. And so that was one of the things we found. And so we looked for other factors that also correlate. And of course, we found them. And that is the
median household income. So here it goes, same, like we are looking at the excess mortality normalized by population, by state, as a function of the median household income. And again, this one is strong correlation.
Yeah. And it suggests, if you want to interpret it, that a state in which the median household income would be $130,000 a year or more, there would have been no excess mortality in such states. I mean, that's a kind of interpretive comment you can make when you see a graph like this.
Yeah.
But the fact that there is this strong correlation is very clear. Yeah.
Another factor we looked at was obesity. We looked at obesity and poverty in the previous paper as well. But yeah, this one. So that one was a strong correlation or
yes.
It's not as strong as the others, for sure.
Yeah, not as strong. Maybe it was moderate.
It's significant. Yes, I remember. So the other thing, too, is in our previous paper about the USA, we found an even stronger correlation than this related to poverty if you integrated mortality that was occurring in the summer peaks. If you looked at the summer periods, their obesity played a bigger role. And the product of obesity and poverty was an even stronger correlation for those summer deaths. So there's that's another sign of the heterogeneity that we were talking about. So we were trying to understand. Well, there were other correlations regarding the Social Security as well, right?
Yeah. So there are the 2 programs in the United States. So it's I forgot, Social Security Disability Income, maybe, or
yes,
and Social Security Insurance, the second one.
And each individually, they're separate programs, but each individually correlates strongly with the excess mortality.
So correlation of both.
Yes. And then we thought, okay, what's going on here?
Oh, and disability as well. We looked at the disability. So same, the right correlation.
When we looked at those data, I was really surprised by the amount of people who are considered disabled in the US. It's a huge amount, nearly 20% in one state, or at least more than 15%. It's a lot.
Yes.
And it strongly correlates with the excess mortality, indeed.
Yes. That's one of the things that makes the US so different from Canada, for example, and from Western European countries, is the magnitude of the pool of very vulnerable people that are in poverty, that are classified as being disabled, and so on. And we were thinking, well, who are these disabled people? And there's many studies that show that many are mentally disabled. There's 14, we discovered in our research, there's 14 million people in the United States that are classified as having a serious mental illness. And the majority of those people are on very, very powerful psychiatric drugs. And those psychiatric drugs are known to have, a lot of them are known to have very big side effects causing, for example, obesity and many other problems. And they tend to be associated with long-term disability as well. People stay on these drugs basically their whole lives. So there's this massive pool of mentally disabled people who are whose health is severely affected and associated with these very powerful drugs, who are also being cared for. And now imagine what happens to those people when you turn on these severe COVID restrictions where you're concerned about spreading to the point where you isolate people and tell them where they're allowed to and not allowed to go to the washroom, and that they stay in their rooms, and you see them less and you're afraid of them and you're wearing masks and gloves. Imagine the psychological impact on those particular people.
Someone in the comments says a lot of veterans in those numbers. I'm not sure if we can really agree with that, since we see that many of them are actually females and under 50 years old. So it doesn't mean they are not militaries, but I'm not sure we find this data.
Yes, I think you have to say veterans definitely have major health problems. But when you look on the scale of the nation at overall what is happening and what is important in proportion, it may not be the most significant pool of people. Yeah.
And what was very interesting that as we were looking at these correlations, it's like, so we see from moderate to strong and very strong correlation with disability program, disability, obesity, poverty, income. But when we look at the proportion of people age 65 and over in a population, we did not find a correlation, or it's very negligible.
Yeah. Quite a surprise, huh?
Yes. So this is contrary. This is on a by-state basis, and it's contrary to the notion of an infection fatality ratio that would go exponentially with age, that would increase exponentially with age. There is no correlation on a by-state basis with this fraction of people who are 65 and over. And we did the same thing for the fraction of people that are 75 and over and 85 and over. And we find the same kind of shotgun pattern for excess mortality during the COVID period. So this is a very serious rethink. If you have to make a rethink of, is this really the COVID that is being written about in the scientific literature that is said to have an exponential increase in mortality with age in mortality? So that is provides a very serious question mark about what is actually causing the death, right? So we looked at a lot of these things, and we came up, I don't know how much time we have, but we have to make sure that we have enough time to explain what our overall kind of model of the death.
We have some more time, don't worry, like 15 more minutes at least, don't worry.
Well, I'd like to just jump in there and give the result, give the interpretation of what we found. We made a diagram in the paper on page 103 of the paper. I don't know if we can easily show that.
I will show that, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the paper is 100. It's almost 200 pages long with all the graphs and tables and everything. And there's a lot of discussion and details of everything we did. So there's no substitute for actually studying the paper, but this is a kind of graph or diagram of what we believe actually occurred to cause this incredibly large mortality in the United States. So let's each describe one part of this, shall we?
Okay, I can start.
You want to start?
Remember, we talk about injections.
All right. Yeah.
And yes, then we'll come to injections later. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who does the first part?
So I can.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So we have this, as we say, there is a COVID period, and during the COVID period, as soon as there is the declaration of the pandemic, there is a huge reorganization and institutional conditions, regulatory, socio-economic impact on the society, and that we believe, and also it's backed up by very good science from the 90s, that triggers psychological stress and social isolation on the population.
Yes.
That's the first part.
Okay. Who's going to do the second part?
Oh, you do, Denis. It's
Okay.
it's your graph, your wonderful graph.
So it's not hard to imagine that those huge transformations within the society caused psychological stress and social isolation. Now, there is well-established scientific studies that have demonstrated over and over again that psychological stress and social isolation, especially psychological stress, directly impacts the immune system of the individual, makes you much more susceptible to disease, to ill health, and to death. And that is really well established. And not just the correlation is established, but also mechanistically, it's been demonstrated in recent studies at the molecular level that this is actually happening, that the psychological stress directly means physiological stress, means changes in terms of inefficiency of the immune system. And so that link is established and is unquestionable. So we have a decreased immune system, and therefore this causes mortality. These are the conditions under which vulnerable people can die. Do you want me to continue, or
yes. Yeah?
So what we came to believe is that how are they going to die mechanistically? They are immunocompromised. They are already very vulnerable. This is the pool of the most vulnerable people who have poverty, obesity, and everything else. And we looked at the CDC data in our previous study and found that there had been a huge comorbidity epidemic of bacterial pneumonia that is reported in the CDC data. So what is called COVID-19 is explicitly on the death certificates associated with bacterial pneumonia. And we also found that the prescriptions of antibiotics dropped significantly during the COVID period. And this is really important for the poor states, which are the states that usually get the highest prescription rates of antibiotics.
Which are mostly southern states, right?
Yes. Southern states are usually clearly, when you look at a map of the prescription rates by state, they are getting large amounts of prescriptions of antibiotics. So they're very susceptible, especially to lung infections and so on. And then you have the scientists saying, but this is a viral respiratory disease. There was a paper to that effect in a top tier journal saying, therefore, it's irresponsible to be prescribing too many antibiotics because this is a viral disease. And so the medical community and jurisdictions stopped prescribing antibiotics precisely at a time when bacterial infections were a major co-infection at least. And so this brought us to conclude that what actually had killed people was bacterial. The final mechanistic cause, if you needed to attribute one, would be bacterial pneumonia.
So can we say that, in fact, this excess mortality is largely due to untreated bacterial pneumonia in this category, this very specific category of vulnerable people in the US, which is a massive pool and that you don't really find in Western Europe or in Canada, or not in that amount at least. And this may explain this extraordinarily new mortality regime in the US.
Yes, and that model that we're proposing, that hypothesis that we're making that is shown in this graph, also coincides with the idea that bacterial pneumonia is known to be a killer of young people. It's a very effective killer of anyone who is immunocompromised, irrespective of their age. And that's well known as well. So that's what we're proposing. We're basically saying something very radical here. We're saying we don't care that you've attributed all these deaths to so-called COVID-19.
Mhm.
We don't care what's on the death certificate, really. We're just looking at it in order to try to surmise what might have really happened. But we believe that bacterial lung infections were ultimately the mechanistic killer of people that you made immunocompromised by the incredible stress that you imposed on them, and they were already pools of extremely vulnerable people. That's what we think happened. And we even went further in our previous paper.
Mhm.
We said that the medical doctors that were convinced that they had saved lives using ivermectin were probably treating bacterial pneumonia at a time where you could not prescribe antibiotics,
Exactly.
morally speaking, and you had to call everything COVID-19, and they were using ivermectin, which is proven scientifically to be a very effective drug against bacterial lung infections.
Antibacterial.
So maybe there are specific patients that they're convinced that they've saved were saved in this way. So we even added that contribution to the question.
Okay. And I think it would be good to say a word about injections, how they saved or not lives, and how they impacted the all-cause mortality in the US.
Well, that's a main conclusion of our paper.
So maybe I can show a graph just for introducing. So I'll show this up.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go back to what we are used to see now, the all-cause mortality on a weekly basis in the United States from January 2019 through to January 2022. So here we have this vertical line here, the full solid black line. It's the week of the 11th of March 2020 when the WHO declared the pandemic. So before that, it's the pre-COVID period. And from that line, it's COVID period. And it's 100 weeks in our data we have. Now, what we did actually, we divided this period in two, so 50 weeks, not because it was convenient, it was also convenient, but mainly because this is what we will call the pre-injection period and the injection period. Why? Because you will see here there is on the second axis, the y-axis here, there is the cumulative number of injected individual by week. So on the same week, you will have the total number of deaths and the cumulated number of injected people.
Yes, so that allowed us to think of the COVID period as being two periods, a period that essentially not many injections had occurred, and a period where the mass of the injection campaign had been accomplished. And so we then used our quantification methods to quantify each of those periods within the COVID period and compare that to the historic trend. So I believe you have we have graphs in our paper that show this nice integration where we divide things up into now 50-week periods.
This one.
Yes. So now the black points represent the integral mortality for 50-week periods, and the last black point on the right is for the injection period within the COVID period. The previous one is for the COVID period prior to injections. And then historically, over the same time integration, you have the various points there. So you can clearly see the historic trend, clearly see the increase in the COVID period, and clearly see that the two parts of the COVID period have comparable integrated mortalities. You don't all of a sudden have a decrease because you've vaccinated, injected. I mean, how many injections are we talking about? Hundreds of millions of injections in that period, and virtually no impact on mortality. So that's one way to look at it, is the integrated. Yeah.
And that's for the whole United States. But again, in the paper, if you want to look, or we can show it quickly, we did the same by age group. So that's the whole USA, all ages together, and then you will have by age group. So here it's for the youngest, which is up to 24 years of age included. See, there is here is a lot of noise, but still there is we cannot say like the injection period was impacting the mortality.
Well, yeah. You cannot say that it was reducing the mortality.
Yeah, sorry.
For sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, which means the injections may not have saved any life?
That's right. That's a major point that we make in the paper, is that we see no evidence that the injection campaign, as massive as it was, averted any deaths whatsoever. And we're now, we did this exercise of quantifying these different periods, but we also did the exercise of comparing the actual structure of the mortality by time data with the actual campaign, the rate of injections. And we looked for synchronicity between the injections and either increased or decreased deaths. And there we found some interesting things. Now we're looking at, that's a different one. That's the, that's the histogram of the integrated deaths for the two periods. Yeah.
So maybe this one by age?
And that's by age, yeah. But I'm thinking, I'm jumping ahead to looking for clear evidence of, did suddenly injecting a lot of people cause a surge in death, for example, or induce a drop in mortality. Because we have this high resolution data with time, can we say anything about that?
We have the by age group, or?
Yeah, by age group would be good.
Yeah.
So this is the injections for that age group compared to the mortality by time for that age group. And that's the youngest age group, up to 24 years of age. So you have this large increase in doses being injected. How many million there on that y-axis, and virtually no sign of, really no systematic sign of saving lives.
Maybe even some kind of growth in mortality, not huge, but
yeah, maybe not in. Maybe it's that's difficult to say, but on this age group,
if there is an increase, it's not huge anyway.
Yeah,
not as many people think that those injections have killed millions, but we can't really say that at the same time.
Not at all. No. The all-cause mortality has not been dramatically increased compared to what it was in the pre-injection period within the COVID period. Okay. So it's not like all of a sudden there was another major catastrophe that increased mortality even more. No, the incredible hardships of the COVID period have maintained a high mortality throughout the COVID period.
So you mean that in the COVID era, the pre-injection period and the post-injection period, the injection period, are basically similar in terms
they're
of
comparable in terms of integrated
comparable, yep.
mortality.
Mhm.
Comparable
Yeah.
in terms of integrated mortality. But now I'm pointing to trying to find evidence by looking at time synchronicity of whether the vaccines injections may have induced death or not. You know, we're turning our attention to that, as we did in the paper, right?
So for that, we actually looked at the by state resolution of the data. So I don't know which one you like.
What was one of the first states that's Michigan. So that's
Michigan.
That's another problem. Michigan is very unique, and we described the unique case of Michigan in the paper.
So there is maybe Alabama.
Yes. So this is all-cause mortality by week for Alabama compared to the cumulative injections by week. And what's stunning in southern states like Alabama is this huge summer peak that occurs, bigger than anything else in mortality, that coincides with a stepwise increase in cumulative injections, right?
Yeah, something really happened in Alabama and Michigan.
This coincidence, if you like, occurs in all the states that have a very large summer mortality like that. So Mississippi, which we're seeing now.
Sorry, I will have to chart Mississippi now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
maybe we can look at a few more states.
Georgia.
Right.
I just need to plug my computer. I'm so sorry.
Do it, Marine. Do it, Marine. No worries. Before it shuts down. And I wanted, Denis, maybe that you talk about virus, because maybe this population we're talking about, those vulnerable people, is not as included as the more general population in this database.
In the VARS database, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can move on to that, but I want to first establish this incredible coincidence between an upsurge in vaccination in injections and this peak, this summer peak, which already a late summer peak is completely unusual epidemiologically. That you have this incredible coincidence that is quite dramatic and is systematic in all the states that have a large late summer peak in mortality at that time, which is happening right when you're increasing the vaccination. Well, that increase in vaccination coincides with the programs that have been called vaccine equity programs, where the states and the federal government were pushing to vaccinate everyone, especially the ones that had not been vaccinated, which means especially in the poor states, especially in the states where the people were harder to reach, were more isolated, and so on. So there was, at the same time that there was a huge push in so-called vaccine equity, there was this, and you can see it in this stepwise increase in the injection rate. There was at the same time this huge peak in mortality that came up that is completely unusual because it's in the summer. So is there a quantitative link between how many people you injected and how many people died? And so you can look at what the injection toxicity is from the VARS data. You can calculate on a per dose basis what's the risk of people dying. And it's very clear in the VARS data, you have death occurring immediately after injection within the first 5 days or so. There's a big peak as a function of time there. So it should happen immediately if there is a link. And if you look at the VARS data and you look at the toxicity on a per dose basis, it's smaller than what would be needed to make the correlation in the graphs that we're showing here. But you have to understand that under a vaccine equity program where you're hiring people and rushing to go and vaccinate everyone as quickly as possible, especially those groups, the caretaker who sees the death doesn't necessarily know or care to know that they were injected recently. Okay, there's a kind of a disconnect because you've got a whole crew coming in just trying to inject people as quickly as possible, and they're counting injections, and they're celebrating the fact that there's going to be this equity. And then you've got people dying, these vulnerable people in institutions and so on. And will that necessarily be reported in VARs? I would argue that, since it's voluntary in the sense that it's not automatically recorded, that maybe the person that saw the death, that reported the death, that had to fill out the death certificate, didn't necessarily know that recently they'd been vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so there's a loophole there in the VARs reporting. And totally. Also, these are the people who died, we believe, are the most vulnerable. And generally, in the big, large-scale injection program, you avoid injecting the most vulnerable because they're too vulnerable to be challenged in this way by the injection. So there's a disconnect between the overall VARs data, when you're trying to establish toxicity, and what may have actually been happening in the field. So given that, we concluded that it was possible that this large surge in mortality was associated with the vaccination increase at that same time.
Yep. Okay, so that's a very strong conclusion, very interesting link that may be between those vulnerable people pool that's very large in the US and these injection equity programs.
Well,
okay.
The other thing too, let's not forget that huge peak in mortality we're seeing in those states in the summertime is for the young adults age group.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's more the young adults that were proportionally killed during the injection period of the COVID period. Mm-hmm. And you were showing that earlier, Marine. We were
this table.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you showed a histogram of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the histogram. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Only the two periods, the two.
I would show all three. Why not?
3 months. Okay.
Yeah. There we have. What is that again?
So the excess mortality normalized by the pre-COVID period for the whole COVID period. So the light blue is the excess mortality,
right,
relative to the base for the whole COVID period. And the two other colors, the dark blue and the orange, are respectively the excess mortality of the pre-injection period of the COVID period for the dark blue, and of the injection period of the COVID period for the orange.
And that's for the entire United States.
Yep.
Exactly.
So here we see a dramatic proportion, or a dramatic kind of relative increase for the age group 25 to 44 in the injection period.
Exactly.
At the same time, where we know that many states had a massive peak in mortality for that age group that was synchronous with a stepwise increase in vaccination. So we see that the injection period age structure that we're seeing here is different from the pre-injection period of the COVID period age structure. And we know what's happening in specific states, that there's this huge peak for that age group that coincides with a stepwise increase in the injections. So it leads us to think that the injections would have had a negative impact on mortality, meaning would have caused mortality. Oh, that's an interesting one too. That, or rather the
other one,
the other one of where you have the 10. Yes, that is the 10 most populous states. And it's that same quantity, the relative excess.
So this one, it's exactly relative excess of the pre-injection period of the COVID period. So here we see like there is nothing, happening really. It's like the constant. This age group is a bit different because it's low statistics as well.
Yeah, but the younger in proportion are dying less compared to their historic trends. So that's normal that it would be lower. I think the statistics are good enough that that's a real effect. And we're seeing how variable it is from state to state, because you've got 10 states and 10 different colors there.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you switch to the injection period, whew,
Exactly.
very different.
Totally different. Yeah.
The age structure now is very different.
Mm-hmm.
So did the virus all of a sudden change from attacking the different ages in a certain way
From one day to another?
to attacking different age groups more viciously than before, as we went from the period where you're not injecting people into the period where you are injecting people? If you want to say that the deaths are all caused by the virus, then the virus would have had to change its characteristics this dramatically and suddenly in that new period.
Maybe that's what they call a variant, right?
Yeah, and especially in the southern states. So the viral properties would have to be state specific and dramatically change how the virus attacks different age groups. If you want to continue this crazy narrative of so-called COVID-19 killed everyone, gave the excess mortality, then you have to say, okay, then that virus that you're proposing has to have these quite remarkable magical properties that have not been documented in controlled conditions in any other respiratory virus before in the history of science. So that's what you have to believe now.
And not even an other respiratory disease before, but also what's reporting for COVID-19.
That's right.
Yeah,
The reporting for COVID-19, even in the later so-called variants and at later times, the age structure of the fatality is the same in controlled clinical studies. So those are the contradictions that we have to deal with if we want to continue to believe the massive propaganda narrative that is being advanced in our direction.
So in one sentence, maybe we can say that when you do a fine analysis of all-cause mortality in the US, it's impossible that a so-called virus created this excess mortality because of the heterogeneity of data by age group, by state, etc., and also because it's so correlated to poverty, to median income, to obesity, and not to age, contrary to what we were expecting. So how can we conclude that in a few sentences, like a take-home message for the people who are following us?
I think our summary diagram of the hypothesis that we're putting forward is a good way to conclude. If we come back to that and talk about the injection,
yes,
I think that's a good way to conclude.
Let me share this. Okay, it's not this one, it's here.
Now, for those of you who will be the listeners that will be reading the paper, it's on page 103 of the paper. But this is the central hypothesis, and what's important to realize here is that we're saying that the immune system is compromised by this incredible stress because of the huge structural changes in society, but at the same time you are injecting people. So and the injection is known to be toxic in the sense it definitely causes death that is closely correlated in time within 5 days. That's so clear in the VARS data, which I've studied in separate studies. Okay, so you're challenging these incredibly vulnerable people who are immunocompromised with the vaccine. So you're doing this at the same time. And so the mortality we think is due to this, to the bacterial pneumonia. But at the same time, you're injecting these incredibly vulnerable people who are susceptible to getting bacterial pneumonia, who are immune compromised, and because of vaccine equity, you're injecting them, you're challenging their bodies even with the injection in addition to that. So it's important to realize that the vaccine itself may not be incredibly deadly on the average person, on most people, on people who are not high performance athletes in the field and so on. But it's known that you have to make a clinical decision as to whether or not you're going to inject someone with an injection like this that has mortality associated with it. Because if they're too fragile, they should not be injected. There's a clinical decision there that needs to be made. How well were those decisions being made in the midst of a huge political vaccine equity program? So those are all the questions that have to be asked.
I think this is very important what you just said, Denis, because usually this is what we hear. It's completely the opposite. We hear that people who are vulnerable and immunocompromised must be protected, so they must receive this injection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's turning the logic on its head. It's completely crazy, but the kind of crazy we've come to expect in the COVID period. Yeah.
We're there still. Well, it's kind of quiet now, so we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months.
Well, we do have an indication of what's going to happen because we looked at the most recent data. That's how we ended our article, right? We looked at the most recent data, and that's very fascinating.
But I'm more like talking about new policies, supposedly health policies, lockdowns, whatever, equipment to supposedly protect you or whatever. But so we don't know what's going to happen in that sense. But at least we can observe after just in just 2 years, we can see that what happened in the US is historical. It's never been seen before. And it's mostly due to the policies that were put in place and that massively attacked the most vulnerable people in the US, and not any virus. So I think that's a very, very strong paper.
There are always viruses, and there's always a whole ecology of viruses and pathogens out there. That's just a given. That's the background. But the incredible mortality that we have quantified and studied and examined cannot possibly be due to a particular virus that would have caused all of this, right? That's our conclusion. I think if we have time, maybe. Is Marine frozen out of the conversation?
I don't know. Yeah, I think she is. I tried to share something she wanted to show, but yeah, she's kind of frozen, I think.
Okay. I was going to end by showing her in the appendix. There's the latest data, and maybe having a little discussion about that. But
I can share it. Do you know what?
Marine's back.
Oh, she's back.
Sorry, I got interrupted.
Yeah. Okay.
You want to share anything?
Yep.
Yes, that in the appendix there's the latest data. I thought we would discuss it.
Yes.
Just to conclude, where is the world going, and where is the USA going, and what might happen in the near future? Yes. Yes. Now this is very fascinating because now we looked at the latest data, and for the first time since the beginning of the COVID period, we're coming back to a mortality that is on the historic trend. So this summer that is just in process, we seem to be back to a normal mortality. Now that's remarkable because and we have to wait and see the data as we go further.
Because here we are March or April, but summer is coming, so we're looking forward.
Right. So we have to see what's going. But even in March and April, you're already down there. So as the populations responded, different states said, no way, we're not doing this anymore, as people relaxed. And after you had already killed the most vulnerable, now mortality is coming down. it appears, and it came down very suddenly as the summer started. So it's going to be fascinating to see the data into this summer and then beyond.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marine and Denis, for being my hosts today and for being my host for this first Science with Consciousness in English. We'll meet again in just a few hours, but in French this time. Some people were complaining that the broadcast was in English, but that's our game today. We're doing 2 broadcasts, one in English now that we're finishing in a few minutes, and one in French at 9 p.m. French time. Donc, on se verra à 9h pour les francophones dans quelques heures, donc à 9h, heure française. Et on fera tout en français cette fois afin que vous puissiez profiter de l'émission. Thank you very much, Marine and Denis. Any last word to finish?
That was a great pleasure to share our work together in English.
Yes, it was quite an experience to do it in English. The 3 of us speaking in English together, yeah.
So now, Denis, you know how we talk in English, both of us. And so it will be my pleasure to see you just at 9 p.m. So be there for the French part. It will be an equivalent, but all in French, an analysis of an explanation of the mortality in the US based on our latest article. So see you later, French-speaking people. And maybe we'll do some more broadcasts in English sometime later as well. I don't know yet, but it was fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're finishing with this theme, and I'll say bye to everybody, and I will be happy to discuss. You can comment our article on ResearchGate, so I'll put the link maybe one last time, and you can comment and you can reach us if you have any question or if you want to understand some specific points. We'll be happy to answer you. Thank you very much. See you soon. And have a nice day. Bye-bye.